Hello, everybody. This is Sean from the After the Ether podcast, and today I am joined by a special guest. I am joined by Professor Benjamin Nicholas Lawrence. Professor Lawrence works at the University of Arizona. He specializes as a legal historian, specifically in the area of Africa and specifically West Africa. Professor Lawrence, first of all, thanks for coming on.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
I'd just like to sort of just jump straight into it. Whilst I was researching the subject of child labor, I came across a lot of your specific works, and I noticed something that you often refer to a specific group of anti-child labor advocates that you refer to as the neo-abolitionists, and you always seem to imply that this group tend to have good intentions, but sometimes maybe don't serve to benefit the issue as much as they should. I was just wondering if you can expand on that from your end.
Well, the term neo-abolitionist tries to capture a sense of the ideological perspective of the people who are involved in a sector of the anti-slavery, anti-child trafficking, anti-human trafficking group, right? So not all people who are involved in those different political and social and economic movements would identify as neo-abolitionists, and indeed probably some people don't identify by that language at all. But the concept of neo-abolitionist tries to convey a resonance or a similarity with abolitionism from the 18th and the 19th century. So, the idea in the 18th and 19th century was that slavery and slave trading could be ended and should be ended for moral reasons, and that it was possible to envision a world without slavery. And of course, what they were really focusing on was a particular modality of slavery. It's the type of slavery that today most people think of when they think of slavery. It's right, the transatlantic slave trade, the enslavement of people of African descent and their progeny, hereditary, permanent condition, highly racialized. It's the type of slavery that most people think of when they think of slavery. And so ending that particular modality of slavery was something that was accomplished in the 18th and 19th century, right? So the slave trade was steadily abolished, and ultimately, either voluntarily or through enactment of laws or through revolutions like in Haiti or the US Civil War, slavery ended. But neo-abolitionists today sort of have adopted the idea that slavery can be ended. And where I kind of try to distinguish what they're doing from the 19th century abolitionists is to sort of focus on the idea that the conditions of human coercion that give rise to different forms of enslavement are constantly recreating and reinventing themselves. So it's somewhat naive to imagine a world where there will be no slaves. I would like to imagine a world where there would be no slaves. And I'm sure many people would like to think today that there are no slaves, but we know that today more people are in slavery or slave-like conditions than ever before. So abolitionists tend to imagine that there is a world that they can get to. And I think instead of acknowledging the reality that gives rise to some of those and recreates forms of coercion. So just to be clear, I'm not criticizing their intent and their moral or ideological perspective. It's much more a reflection on my part as a scholar to understand what can and cannot be achieved.
Because something that I also sort of came across whilst reading your different works and something that maybe not everyone watching is clear about, is there any sort of distinction when we're talking about child slave as opposed to child laborer?
Yeah, there are important distinctions. And just to sort of follow, so continuing what I was saying, so anti-child labor and anti-child slavery advocates who imagine a world where that's not happening, that's more plausible for me than abolishing slavery, right? The idea of abolishing slavery is almost, not quite, it's almost as untenable as abolishing rape or abolishing murder, right? These things are sadly part of the human condition. There will always be people who want to coerce other people, who will force people violently through threats or through other forms of coercion to do things, often labor and often without pay. But child labor is a different and a much narrower area, right? So it's conceivable that a very well-regulated economy can extinguish child labor. The United States, for a long time, extinguished almost all forms of child labor from the 1930s and the 40s in the Depression and the World War II, when incidents of child labor were very common, particularly in farms. It was steadily phased out by statute and by administrative acts and pursuit. Now, today, of course, we've seen a total change, right? We've just seen children dying in meatpacking plants in Mississippi and Alabama, Louisiana. I mean, it's horrific to believe that some states, particularly Republican-led states, are trying to loosen the constraints on child labor, economic reasons that they provide, but they're, I don't think, particularly credible. But in West Africa or other parts of the developing world, abolishing child labor is possible, just in the same way as it was in Europe and in North America and in other parts of the world. It requires statutes, it requires a willing state, it requires enforcement of those statutes, but it also requires providing options and opportunities for those children so that they are able to realize their objectives and their parents' objectives of them becoming educated and potentially employable, right? So we cannot separate the decline of child labor in the United States until very recently with the massive increase in free public education, right? So when going to school became mandatory and public education was at its peak in the 1970s and 80s, child labor was at an all-time low in the United States. So, of course, today, when child labor is increasing, it's often young immigrant children, sometimes undocumented children, people that the advocates of these new deregulation systems, particularly in places like Oklahoma and I think most recently Arkansas, these states don't envision it as their responsibility to provide education for those migrants or for the undocumented migrants in particular. And so they see, one of their ideas is that they see child labor as legitimate use of the time of these people who they otherwise would not like in their state. So if we go back to Ghana, right? In Ghana, the expansion of child education, the provision of public schooling, the reduction in the cost of getting into school uniforms, school books, providing food and meals for students, making it accessible for them to get there, providing running water or wells where girls and boys can have the hygiene necessary to continue their schooling, right? All of those things, once those things are provided, then the child labor alternative will decline. I mean, there are just so many good historical examples that show that to be the case.
Because from what I gathered regarding your work and as well as the work of some of your peers in this regard, is that often the neo-abolitionists from their end tend to focus a lot more on the trafficking aspect of child labor and child slavery and sort of have the aim to demonize certain groups and paint children as victims in this sense, which obviously in many cases they are. However, you seem to imply that often the best way for going about solving the problem is through focusing a lot more on labor rights and social services rather than the law enforcement aspect of it. Am I correct in this assessment?
I think there's obviously a holistic approach is required, right? We need, to end child trafficking, to end child slavery, and to end child labor. It requires a state willing to do that, a state that passes laws, a state that provides for the enforcement of those laws, that funds the enforcement, that provides alternatives for children, such as schools, that provides accessible schooling, accessible healthcare and water, running water, and all sorts of the necessary provisions to make it the most obvious choice. Parents would much rather see their children educated and earning a higher income than laboring in coca plantations using machetes where they can injure themselves or spraying noxious pesticides, which will, stunt their growth or sterilize them or otherwise kill them, or working fishing boats in Lake Volta. Parents would much rather see their children educated. I mean, there's just no credible data to support the view that parents would rather their children work in dangerous conditions above having educational opportunities and further gainful employment when they're an adult. So unless we address what draws children into that market first, then all of the other attacks on particular modalities, particular aspects like trafficking dimensions or the role of parents or what's going on in one particular place, unless that's addressed first, those things are just sort of piecemeal, right? So the children who work in coca plantations in Ghana or Ivory Coast or Nigeria or Cameroon, these are often children who came from much further away, from much further north, from the impoverished Sahelian regions, where they're often one of several children, possibly one of 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 siblings. They might be one of the younger ones. The parents are unable to provide for all of those children. A recruiter comes to town and says, look, I have this great opportunity. If you give me 1 or 2 of your children, I'll take them to get gainful employment in the coca plantation. They will send back money. And so, for a parent who has no alternative, who can't envision a world where where their children go to school, become educated, and then are able to work as adults, that thing that is offered in front of them is a no-brainer. So it's all very well to police borders or within a country's police regions that are prone to trafficking, then to find those children and to try to work out where they're from and try to recover them and return them to their families. But unless the core economic conditions remain unresolved, then it's really just putting your finger in a hole in a bucket, right, where another leak will spring.
Expanding on this sort of aspect, should it be the case that the core conditions that cause children to have to work in these sorts of environments, should they not be arranged from obviously the social services aspect and from the labor rights aspect? And should we go exclusively in the law enforcement route? So just going about closing down cocoa plantations that are employing children and that are working children in potentially hazardous environments. Do you think that this could possibly have an effect where people are more likely to be hoisted into conditions of extreme poverty?
So I do not advocate for increased criminalization of all sectors of the child migrant, child trafficking, child labor economy. But I think criminalization of particular communities, particular targeted individuals, syndicate leaders, people who are known repeat offenders, that's a bit different, right? So I am not a wholesale advocate for criminalization, but laws play an important role. And if they are written carefully, and if they are enforced with discretion, which is appropriate on the part of the prosecutor, then they can be very effective tools. So worst abusers, particularly corporations and large entities of domestic or national or international dimensions, or repeat offenders who are known traffickers, who are known recruiters, that has an important role. I don't have much time for the argument that is advocated by some people that closing off, that criminalizing this sector of the economy closes off an important economic activity for impoverished families, because I think that is self-defeating and it doesn't deal again with the core issue. Yes, there is poverty. And yes, these jobs are being filled by children who are often from impoverished families. You certainly won't find wealthy Ghanaian families from Accra sending their children to cocoa plantations, or wealthy families or middle-class families from Abidjan sending their children to work in plantations. In Abidjan, they're almost all children from Burkina Faso and Mali. And if you go to Ghana, they're almost all children from northern Ghana or from Togo or from Burkina Faso or Niger. And some of them are family members, right? So Ghana has a different tradition, much more family-based local economies. But there is an important distinction between, say, child labor in cocoa plantations and other economies. Cocoa plantations are of a style of agriculture that hasn't yet really lent itself to mechanization. It has resisted the development of mechanization forms that will maybe obviate the need for certain types of labor, right? So there's a whole set of different things going on in cocoa plantations. But cocoa is raised and grown all over the world in not the same conditions, right? So there isn't significant mechanization of cocoa plantations in other parts of the world, but there is less child labor, right? So you have to ask yourself, well, why is that? Why would there be less child labor in other parts of the world where cocoa is produced? Like, I don't know, Ecuador. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. It does happen. But there's trees upon which cocoa is produced. They don't lend themselves very easily to mechanization. Okay, so when you meet people in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire who speak about child labor, they'll explain that children can go underneath the trees and collect the pods. And that's very hard work for adults. And yes, it is hard work for adults, but it's hard work for children as well, right? But they're making that choice. But agricultural labor is hard work, right? Until mechanization changed agriculture in many parts of the world, it was incredibly hard, brutal work for all. And even today, with mechanization, in many parts of the world, it's still very hard work. So a lot of the arguments that are used, they fall apart upon critical analysis. And the same goes to your general idea, the general question you were asking about, are we closing off a poverty alleviation avenue by criminalizing this? I don't think so, right? Because it's an exploitative process that shouldn't be taking place. So it's not an either or. There are all sorts of ways that it can be remedied, and simply saying that you're closing avenues down for children who are otherwise impoverished or families, I would just return us to the same question, right? Which is that there are ways that it can be ameliorated through better provision for education and better provision for healthcare, the types of processes that led to the decline of child labor in Europe and North America after World War II. At the same time, I think it's important to also understand that the pressure to produce products at very low prices, the pressure that comes from the West, that comes from Northern Europe and North America, right? The pressure to have affordable, quote unquote, or cheap chocolate, for example, is a factor, right? Labor costs are often I'm not sure specifically about cocoa production. I think probably the costs of cocoa production are much more about the movement of the cocoa and the processing, like the labor costs are a very small part. But in some production streams, labor is a very important part of the overall cost. And so, again, more sort of libertarian or liberal economic thinkers target that. And they say, well, we need to have cheaper products, and this is the consequence, or this is the legacy, or this is the only way that it can be achieved. But I think the labor costs in cocoa production are very marginal compared to the added on costs. So I think upon close scrutiny, that argument or that idea that somehow a poverty alleviation avenue is being foreclosed, it just doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
Okay, and sort of building on that idea, because we also mentioned the case study of Ghana. A lot of literature refers to the 2005 Human Trafficking Act. And it's quite interesting that this piece of legislation within Ghana has coincided with them falling down the rankings in the anti-trafficking report to a lower grade regarding how they're tackling child labor. What do you make of this shift in legislation seemingly making the situation worse overall?
Okay, so I think it's important to separate these. There's no causal relationship between poor legislation and making things worse that we can unequivocally establish. Ghana was early to the table of legislating against child trafficking and various forms of child exploitation compared to many parts of Africa. Came to the table very early on because of a lot of international attention that was drawn to the cocoa farms. Other countries like Ivory Coast and Nigeria, Cameroon, which also have a lot of cocoa production and also have child labor, came to the table quite a bit later. So at the same time, and I've met the person who drafted the law in 2005, right? And she is a very sophisticated legislative drafter. She knows what she's doing. But at the same time, they're working with it within a lot of sort of complex and frustrating political context, right? So there's a lot of pressure to pass a statute. And that first statute, while it looked on its face to be addressing some of the concerns, particularly the concerns international activists had, at the same time, it left out key definitions, and they hadn't spent enough time consulting with enforcement officials to work out how specific subsections of the statute could be enforced. And so it was only within a few years when they tried prosecuting particular people that those prosecutions either fell apart or they didn't even get going from the outset. And that is a consequence of a relatively poorly drafted law in terms of enforcement and in terms of the terminology. So while the statute itself, I think, is competently written, that's only one part of the statutory process that enables a law to be implemented and enforced, right? There's a whole set of other statutes that are already on the books that need to be integrated. That needs to be taken into consideration. There needs to be implementing legislation. That didn't happen in Ghana for several years, right? So they couldn't actually implement that integration. They couldn't assign responsibilities from the statute to various ministries, right? There was a fight among the ministries about which should have responsibility for this. Should it be the Ministry of Women and Children? Should it be the Ministry of Law, the Attorney General's office? Should it be somehow the Ministry of the Interior? right? So there was this struggle over this, and I think there were other ministries involved. That should have been addressed at the statute level, right? That should have been addressed by Parliament. Parliament should have made that decision. Parliament in Ghana is unicameral, which is also, in my personal opinion, a bit of an issue. When you only have one legislature, not two, drafting and passing laws, you have one less set of checks and balances and set of eyes and scrutiny. Right? So having two houses of assembly provides for different types of scrutiny by different types of people, and also committee work. So there's this, there's a bigger set of issues, right? I'm just giving you some sense of them. There are many more we could talk about. At the same time, Ghana is responding to what it's being told from abroad, right? In order to get X, Y, or Z from the United States or other countries, you need to do this. And that is part of a statute that was passed in the United States, right? So the Victim of Trafficking Protection Act that created, among other things, the Trafficking in Persons reports, and then created, as a result of that, a series of rankings of states, which we now do every year. That itself created its own set of pressures. Yes, Ghana has moved up and down over more than now 23 years of reports, right? Its status has moved, but that's because the goalposts have also moved and the data collection has expanded considerably, right? So I don't think we can make a causal link directly between relatively poor enforcement in the early 2000s and how Ghana is being portrayed abroad, or how it's being, if you like, graded abroad. But there are a whole set of local domestic issues that ultimately there was a new or an amendment that was passed, and then there was another amendment that improved, and there was implementing legislation, and there was a lot of training of law enforcement officials, and now they're getting better at it. Ghanaians are training other countries on how to enforce their anti-trafficking statutes. If we were to look at somewhere like Togo or Burkina Faso or Benin, they do next to nothing. But they don't get much attention because they don't have an enormous coca market, right? And they don't have an enormous influx of Western aid, and they don't have the headquarters for all sorts of UN agencies and so forth, right? So Ghana gets a lot of attention because of the size of its economy, the role it plays in the coca market, but also because it is where Europeans and Americans go when they go to West Africa, if they don't go to Senegal.
That's something I notice quite a lot too, is that a lot of the discourse regarding child labor seems to be centered not exclusively around the cocoa industry, but seems to be heavily geared towards the cocoa industry in general. Would you say that this in itself is a problem?
So it is definitely overrepresented in discussions of child labor and child trafficking and child exploitation as it concerns West Africa. And I think there are several reasons for that, some of which sort of lead into what you're talking about. The coca industry is the most important industry in Ivory Coast. And, along with, say, tourism and gold and mining in Ghana, it's also the most important in Ghana, right? So it's high up there. It's shifting rapidly as tourism and mining is taking an increasing role in the economy. So if we were to sort of disaggregate where enslaved or trafficked children, which sectors of the formal and informal economy they're ending up. In the formal economy, the coca industry and the mining industry are the two most obvious. And they're the easiest for people to investigate. But there's been a long history of sort of state regulation of cocoa production in both Ivory Coast and Ghana. For many decades, the cocoa industry in Ghana operated under a monopsony where the state bought all cocoa. And so there was just a much easier access point for people trying to look at regulations and operations. Mining in Ghana has been in the hands of one or two major companies like Anglo Gold, formerly Ashanti Gold, BHP, Billiton, these international companies. It's much harder to get access to mining sites to regulate and investigate what's going on. And then the other side of mining in Ghana is sort of artisanal and illegal mining, the so-called galamsey mining, which is an epidemic and destroying whole sectors of the rainforest. But that's often not done by children. So it's done by migrants, often funded with money and technology from China, and it's wholly unregulated. So there's all sorts of reasons why cocoa has an overblown role in narrations, and some of them make perfect sense, right? It's the role of the economy, it's the accessibility of the industry. When scholars want to write about something, they read first about cocoa, so it's naturally draws them to them. Same as activists, right? There's stuff that you can sink into and narrate. But do the majority of children who are trafficked end up in cocoa plantations and cocoa fields? That I don't think is the case. I think probably the largest sector of informal child work, whether they've been trafficked or coerced, or whether they're working in dangerous conditions, is probably farming in general, and domestic labor. Domestic settings is probably the next, right? So cocoa is only one part of that. But it's much harder to go into people's homes and see what kinds of practices are taking place. It's much harder to work out which sectors of agriculture you should be targeting for investigation. And so that bias is kind of built into the analysis, unfortunately.
Just one thing that I'm just gathering from this interview in general is you seem to be emphasizing a lot the importance of good governance and proper actual enforcement of laws, such as those in the style of the 2005 Human Trafficking Act. So in light of that, regarding what we were originally talking about regarding the abolitionist advocate, would you say that in the grand scheme of things, in comparison with poor governance and poor social conditions, do you think that their presence is serving to only as a minor problem towards this issue, or is it sort of expounding upon these already prevalent issues within state itself?
We're turning to neo-abolitionists. Is that what your question is?
Yes,
Yeah. So I think they play an important role and a necessary role in keeping pressure. But I'm a long-time member of Amnesty International. I'm a long-time member of Anti-Slavery International. For many years, I was a patron of Anti-Slavery International. I firmly believe that the role they play and the pressure they bring to bear is important and consequential. And the types of activities that they do to showcase abuses can transform things on the ground, right? And there's a rich history about this, going all the way back to transatlantic slave trade. Royal Dalton was making sugar bowls with signs that it was not made by slaves in West Indies, but made by sugar in India, or the anti-red rubber activities in the early turn of the 19th, 20th century, exposing the brutality there. So campaigns of all sorts can be very effective. And I think really where I depart from, as I kind of indicated earlier, where I depart from neo-abolitionists is I don't have any illusions that slavery can be ended once and for all. If we look at Mauritania, since its independence in 1960, we can see exactly why that is the case, right? Mauritania has ended slavery by its own account, by its own admissions to the United Nations at least 6 different times. It's ended slavery in the Constitution. It's ended slavery through statute. It's ended slavery through edicts. It's passed additional laws that have combated particular types. And yet we know that slavery continues in Mauritania because there are people who flee Mauritania and seek asylum who have been enslaved. And the government of Mauritania arrests anti-slavery campaigners. And that's because slavery in Mauritania is also tied very much to historical heritage, background, and lineage. And in many places, it's an inherited status. It's a caste that permanently marks someone as enslavable. So those types of forms of slavery, they can be ended. Attitudes about caste can be changed. Statutes can be passed that can end particular forms of enslavement. We've seen that in the past, and we've seen that in recent history, but I don't have any illusions that there'll be a world where people will not exploit one another and coerce one another and try to keep one another in forms of enslavement and coercion, even if it's on a smaller scale than sort of the large-scale slaveries of the past, right? Today, slavery is illegal in every country in the world in all sorts of ways, but we know it happens, and we know that there are more people today in slavery and slave-like conditions than ever before in human history. You know, the analogy I usually use for my students is to think about tax law. Tax law is changed every year in most countries because accountants and lawyers, and tax lawyers in particular, are particularly adept at finding ways to get around the law. And we need to be vigilant. That is, people advocating for tax law need to be vigilant about making sure that those who should be paying taxes are. And the same goes for slavery. Slavery, ultimately, it's a socioeconomic system, right? It's an economic model of coercion. People make the decision that it is cheaper for them to coerce people to do things for them rather than pay people. Now, there are other variations of slavery, so it's not just one uniform thing. But that is primarily what's going on in most of the types of circumstances we've been talking about. People are making a conscious decision that it is acceptable, that it is doable, and that it is much more cost effective for them to use this type of labor than they would paid remunerative labor. And it's not confined to Ghana or Mauritania, right? There's people who in the city of Katy in Houston, Texas, who were convicted of enslaving a woman for 3 years. They brought her from Nigeria and they kept her in their house and they made her work for no pay. And they were convicted and they were sentenced to jail and they were forced to repay her all the wages that she would have been due, which were hundreds of thousands of dollars, along with punitive fees. So they made the choice not to pay her because it was better for them. And that's usually, not always, that's usually what's going on. And so because of that, I don't subscribe to the neo-abolitionist ideology that is of a small sector of these people, right? Not everybody thinks like this, but I don't subscribe to the idea that it can ever be ended. But I do feel that there is a very strong place for carefully written and sophisticatedly thought out and well-enforced statutes that target the main perpetrators of these types of activities, but also they go hand in hand with creating better opportunities and equity for people who are in poverty, so that these are not things that they can choose not to allow their children or family members to be drawn into. If they have some type of economic choice, that will decrease the amount of slavery.
Okay, a very succinct way of ending it. So, Professor Lawrence, thanks a lot for your time. This was a really insightful interview. Thanks again, and I wish you a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.